So first, I want to thank you all for having me out again. I believe our last presentation I did, we talked about the Enigma because you guys had just opened up your exhibit. That Enigma is from our collection. So everything we have, we own about the 75% of the world's known enigmas. I say known because obviously sometimes they show up on eBay or grandma may have one in the attic. We never know, right? So definitely take a look at that. Today, we're going to be talking about sharing the burden and specifically more or less about women during World War II. Oop, come on. So the first thing I want to do is I want to get a little bit of terminology going. And the first one is about codes. So codes change entire words or phrases into something else. The easiest way to explain this is we all get in the car, right? Red means stop, green means go. Those are codes. In this case, we're talking about codes on a secret level, but codes in general, they just make our life easier. They're not necessarily to keep secrets, it's for efficiency. The second thing we have is ciphers, and these are changes, these change letters to other things. And so this is what we're going to see with the Enigma and some of the other, um, like purple, I'll talk about, where we're changing individual letters into something else. And lastly, a key. So this is the method to alter the message. So code books use a key or a list to set up the encryption device. So like the Germans use key lists every day to set up the enigmas. That'll tell them how the rotors are set, how the plug boards are set. And it can also indicate a pattern to rearrange those letters as well. So prior to World War I, with the exception of medical fields, women were not allowed to enter military service. But that did not keep them out of cryptology. And in fact, throughout American history, we have seen them act as spies, cryptanalysts, and linguists, and each of them making a contribution to that cryptologic field, even beginning before World War II. A wonderful example is Elizabeth Friedman. She actually earned an English literature degree from Hillsdale College in Michigan. And in here, so as I said, she graduated with her English Lit degree. They were really trying to figure out if Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. And the theory was is that it was actually written by Sir Francis Bacon. And his cipher was actually hidden in the original folio's use of fonts. So theoretically, by studying the printings, the cipher could be found and then deciphered, revealing his authorship. Uh, the so-called cipher, though, never actually came to light. But this is how she became very interested in cryptology, I should say. And while at Riverbank, she later married William Friedman. This is also where she met him. And they moved to Washington, D.C. for his job as the Army's new cryptologic office. And this is where she continued her work in the field as well. She spent much of her career working with the U.S. Treasury Department. And during the Prohibition, she was working with the Coast Guard. It was the Coast Guard's job to keep illegal alcohol out of the United States, but it was coming through on every coastline. And the rum runners would bring alcohol and other contraband in and then anchor off the coast. They would send radio messages to their buddies telling them when and where to make the pickups. And because they knew the Coast Guard would be listening, they were encoding their messages. Elizabeth was brought in to teach sailors how to break the messages so that then they could capture the rum runners. It was not quite simple, but over the decade, Elizabeth had broken over 12,000 coded messages. And while the rum runners were captured, she would then testify in court. And she was able to explain to the jury and show them that it was a scientific and systematic method, not just her guessing, and prove that the men were involved in rum running. She was actually so good at what she did, they actually thought they had a leak inside, not that somebody was breaking in on the outside. So in 1940, before the US was in war, she and her team began reading the messages of Nazi spies in Central and South America. The Coast Guard was intercepting stations and picking up traffic throughout the area. Most of these messages were using a cipher system similar to the rum runners and were not difficult for Elizabeth and her experienced teams of cryptanalysts. Some of these messages reported on the US and British shipping, places that would be attacked by Nazis. Some other intercepts revealed one network that was different, however. and they were not using that simple cipher or even book codes. She took to the ever growing collections of intercepts to create depth and began breaking these as well. She realized they were dealing with a machine, much like the commercial Enigma that she had on hand. Through pure paper and pencil analysis, she actually figured out the wiring of the Enigma machine used by the German spies. Now, these ones are different than the ones that would be used by the German military, but these are also extraordinarily complex. So during World War II, the Coast Guard's office fell to the Navy and Elizabeth. No longer permitted to be its chief, uh, was tasked to monitoring Nazi activities in South America. The spies reported on Allied shipping around these South American ports. 1 million tons of material were sunk by German U boats, and Elizabeth passed her decrypts on as quickly as possible in hope of saving some of these ships from destruction. In the spring of 1942, the FBI was using her decrypts to round up Nazi spies in South America. The Operation Elizabeth and her Coast Guard were actually powerless to stop. So, although some of the spies were caught, the leaders escaped and actually started creating new networks and using harder codes than before. So, through her skill, she and the small team actually began breaking those codes. And a year later, a new Enigma was in place of the Argentine network. I believe. Oh, um, it looks actually just like the other one, in all honesty, but it has an irregular stepping motion. Using the same pencil and paper method as before, she used that depth again, and the very helpful fact that the Germans used the same keystroke for every 28 messages. She actually determined um, what those Enigma wirings were as well. And the spies used other methods, and her team actually was able to solve most of them, and therefore was able to track Nazi SS officers and actually uncovered an entire spy network. The Nazis were trying to get several South American countries to side with the Third Reich. And she and her team were breaking the messages that actually led pressuring to neutral Argentina and its contacts with Germans. So, in the end, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile openly sided with the Allies, which actually prevented the Nazis from gaining control within South America. Of course, no one knew of the Coast Guard and Elizabeth's work outside of these official channels. And it's only been in recent years and news that this was revealed. At the time, however, the FBI and Hoover, James Edgar Hoover, actually took full credit for the success. Her husband, however, William, was the chief cryptologist for the US Army, and he also began hiring mathematicians. His first three hires were men, but he had no problem hiring women either. And he knew that they could not only do the job well, because he was married to one of the best. This is Mary Louise Prather. She was a clerical employee and originally from Morristown, Tennessee. She actually began working at the Signal Intelligence Service in 1938 as an assistant cryptologic clerk. She worked for Mr. Frank Rowlett, the first mathematician that Friedman had hired in the Japanese diplomatic section. Her responsibilities included traffic filing, sorting, typing the transactions, and maintaining the office files. In the next few years, she was promoted to the chief of steganographic section, and her responsibilities extended to include logging and handling of incoming cipher messages and preparation of decrypted messages for distribution. Rowlett's team of cryptanalysts were struggling with this new code, used on what was called the purple cipher. Changing words into code and then ciphering the code is what we call a super encipherment. So basically a double encipherment. The Japanese used a code book to change numbers, punctuation, and frequently used syllables, words, and phrases. In the Japanese Phillips code, the combination CFC represented a period. BKW was short for Bikoku, which is actually the United States, the word they meant. And by encoding much of these messages and then encrypting it again on purple, finding the solution, even if you had a Japanese linguist on hand, was extremely difficult. One of the methods used for breaking that code is to guess what part of that decode might be. So this is actually called cribbing, And one of the best methods to find a crib is to compare an unknown message to a one that's solved when you think they're discussing the same topic. So ideally, the same message would be sent two different systems to two different recipients. If the simpler code could be solved, it made the perfect crib for the difficult code. And the Japanese occasionally did this because not every recipient had the same equipment for their code book. So, Mary Louise played a critical role in this respect. So, due to her careful logging and memory, she actually identified a relationship between two Japanese messages. One had been solved in the system they call K1 code, and another message encoded in the Phillips code and enciphered on purple was not breaking. This was in the spring of 1939, by the way. She realized that the two messages were discussing the same information and brought it to the team's attention. Part of the purple message actually contained the paraphrased version of that K1 message. And this is what they needed to hint into the purple encryption. On another occasion, she was credited with bringing in critical decrypted messages to Rowlett's attention. One in particular discussed the destruction of cryptologic material by Japanese diplomats shortly before Pearl Harbor. After the war, she was provided testimony in the investigation of the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1946, she received the Commendation for Meritorious Civilian Service and later transferred to the Central Research, where for the next 20 years held a variety of positions of increasing responsibility, finally being named the chief of the Soviet Information Division in 1960. 9 years later, she also received the Meritorious Civilian Service Award and retired. Genevieve Grochin was one cryptanalyst that was hired as a civilian mathematician. Genevieve graduated from the University of Buffalo and actually wanted to become a math teacher. But unfortunately, she graduated during the Great Depression and there were no teaching positions available. So then she took the professional mathematician exam, and her scores greatly impressed Friedman. He hired her for the Signal Intelligence Service in 1938. Um, hmm. She and her coworkers were working to break the new Japanese diplomatic cipher known to the Americans as Purple. They spent 18 months analyzing this new system and making use of the information provided by Mary Prather. And with this, Genevieve made a crucial break. Her boss, Frank Rowlett, and a few other men were discussing a problem when she actually entered the room and politely apologized for that. And she took these papers to his desk where she had the worksheets spread. And she pointed to an example, and then another example, and then a third. And she stood back excited, staring at him. He then jumped out and started crying. That's it. That's it. And another one of the cryptanalysts was running around the room. I personally have never met a mathematician, but apparently they were going, woo, all around the place. That's how exciting this was. Mr. Friedman overheard and came in and said, "What is all that ruckus?" And Rowlett goes, "Jean's done it. She's found what we've been looking for." What she had actually
Okay.
done is she had identified anomalies in purple traffic that enabled the team to therefore then break the purple cipher. To celebrate this, they took a break and ran out for Cokes. To give you an example of how hard purple is and how involved it is, this is an example of a cipher. So once it is actually solved, this is the plain text, not the deciphered, it is the deciphered version. And it's not Japanese, as you can see, it's code. So then from there, you can see that there are actually groupings, code groups. So XFC is actually the code word for number. The next three is GJW, and that's the code for the number 15. And FOV means open parentheses. And this would continue down the line. So even broken and solved, the message finally, once you figure it out, will read number 15, part one of two parts, secret to be kept within the department. Paragraph on March 16th, the American ambassador grew, and so forth, as the text would provide. Personally, I have zero clue how they figured this out, even with the pieces that Mary had provided. It's very difficult, as you can see. So on September 27th, 1940, only 1 week after her discovery, the first purple translations were handed in. It was extremely time-consuming paper and pencil process requiring several cryptanalysts, but it did work. Leo Rosen, then an MIT engineer, took a look at the method and then designed a machine to solve the messages rapidly. They used analog machines throughout World War II to read Japanese diplomatic communications. They read, amongst others, the messages of the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, Oshima Hiroshi, and learned not only Japan's intentions, but also the intentions of Germany. Another one of Friedman's early hires was Wilma Zimmerman. She was born in Ohio, and she had a degree in math from Bethany College, West Virginia. She taught school for 4 years until she married and moved to DC around 1936. She was very interested in cryptology after reading an article about William and Elizabeth Friedman in a newspaper, and she managed to enroll in the Navy's correspondence course in cryptology. She enjoyed it and did well, but it wasn't until she took the civil service exam that she was actually hired into the Signals Intelligence Service in 1937, possibly 1938. That one's kind of up in the air. Wilma's initial assignment was to work on Italian diplomatic ciphers. She thought they were fun because they were actually quite easy to solve for her, and she stayed on Italian systems until 1942 when she transferred to the Japanese problem. Within 2 years, she was the head of Department A, which was the team responsible for solving and processing the addresses on the Japanese Army code machines. Addresses were frequently in code and could provide valuable information even if the message itself could not be solved. And she wasn't the only woman supervisor by any means. 7 of the 17 first-line supervisors working on Japanese Army codes were women. And this seems to have been typical in many sections of the Army's cryptologic operation. And she remained in that position throughout the war. After World War II, she transferred to the Chinese team and then to Russia's Venona problem. She left the service in 1949 when she married her second husband. Her first one died shortly after Friedman had hired her, and they moved to Canada. Unfortunately, her second husband also passed away 3 years later, and Friedman learned about this and immediately asked her to return to work on Venona, and she happily agreed. She worked there for a decade, marrying her third husband along the way. And although she left briefly in the 1960s, she was soon back breaking codes for the Vietnam War and before finally permanently retiring in 1973. So, just prior to World War II, a small group of women wanted to assist their country in a voluntary but very useful way. These women were wives of naval officers and were known as the Special Women's Auxiliary Naval Service, also known as SWANs. Hoping to assist the Navy in important fields that lack qualified personnel, 25 women organized the group in 1941. If they were recommended by a Navy officer, security clearances were waived. Mostly they were all wives of officers, so doubt they needed any clearance anyway. They began taking a correspondence class on elementary cryptology that was supplemented by a weekly class from a naval instructor. Within 3 months' time, 21 of the women had completed the course. And by early 1942, approximately 70 women, all wives and daughters of naval officers, worked with the Navy as part of the SWANs. Initially, the women offered a skill on a voluntary basis, requesting to be assigned the work of a cryptographic nature, and they volunteered whenever their time was permitted. By the outbreak of the war, they were working in teams performing cryptanalysis, translation, and censorship. However, their voluntary status did not continue. And in 1942, OP20 or OP20, the Navy's cryptologic organization, was instructed to stop using volunteer workers, and the women began converting to one of the actual different statuses, civilian service, or what they called the $1 a year employees. $1 a year women continued much as they had in their voluntary employment, working as their time permitted, and they literally received quarterly paychecks. Legend has it that some of these 25-cent checks were framed, and the Swans, as a recognized group, began to disappear as members became absorbed into various offices. So on May 15th, 1942, Roosevelt signed the bill establishing the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And in September of next year, the Corps dropped the auxiliary and just became the Women Army Corps, more commonly known as the WACs. In July 1942, just months after creating the WACs, President Roosevelt signed a bill creating the Navy Waves, so women accepted for volunteer emergency service. Like their Army counterpart, thousands of women applied to join the new military service. With slogans like "Free a Man to Fight," enlistment offices around the country were inundated with applications from women. On the first day that the recruitment offices accepted applications for WAC officer training, they had over 10,000 applications. After 1 week, they had 35,000 applications for only 1,000 officer positions. Likewise, the Navy received hundreds of requests for applications each day, even before the forms were available. And they received nearly 25,000 applications for 900 officer positions. Women were greatly needed. Military men in the cryptologic offices were being reassigned to theaters of operation, and the Army Signals Intelligence Service turned to WACs, civilian women and men in deferred status to actually fill these positions that were being opened. So the work was expanding, requiring even more personnel. The Army and the Navy both wanted women cryptologists, but it was difficult to advertise for this kind of secret work. And so, an article in the New York Times described the work as highly confidential and connected with the safety of our forces on the fighting front. Other women were specifically recruited for cryptologic work, and they were usually college women who had been recommended for their mathematical skills. Women in the Army had to meet officer qualifications as well as have a strong math or language skill. The Navy was competing for the same group of women and offered officer status to its cryptographers. However, each service put a higher value on the woman's integrity than her skills. A woman with the right qualifications, but not trained in cryptography, could learn the skills. However, a woman whose loyalty was in question, no matter how qualified mathematically, could not be selected for the highly classified work. As Navy Captain Lawrence Stafford wrote about the women needed for the cryptologic service in the Navy, it's essential that all personnel be especially selected for integrity. Individual qualifications are of a secondary concern and used only as the basis for assignments after integrity has been established. Like the Army, the Navy had several civilians already working in the cryptologic field. The Navy encouraged women to join the waves. However, there were benefits for civilians to remain on the civil service side. They worked in day shifts, received vacations, and could quit if they chose. The Navy needed the waves who would be assigned to the less desirable shifts. Um, the Navy needed waves who could be assigned to less desirable shifts and would do communications work for the duration of the war. However, there's also a downside to the civilian conversations, the conversions into the Navy, and it would take an already skilled woman away from their cryptologic duties for weeks for their Navy indoctrination. And so it was a mixed message, and for the civilian woman working for the Navy received. 59 women from the Op 20G were approved as officer candidates. Their names were submitted along with the request that their indoctrination be staggered in order to avoid the loss of so many women at one time. When it came back for the majority of women would go in November, another request was submitted asking they be sent in smaller groups every 6 weeks. The delay, they said, would ensure no serious disruption of a very important work of a secret nature that would recur as a simultaneous detachment of 35 young women. The groups were staggered, but not at the requested 6 weeks. Both services quickly outgrew their headquarters and had to find other locations. The Army Signals Intelligence Service moved to a former girls' college nearby Virginia, which came to be known as Arlington Hall. And the Navy moved to Mount Vernon Seminary, another girls' school on Nebraska Avenue in Washington, D.C. The Army handpicked the men and women enrolled in their cryptologic course. Initially, the training was provided at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, but later was transferred to Hills Farm Station in Virginia. Those who demonstrated the necessary skills in the first 6 weeks of training continued on. They learned communication security, Army and staff organization from the signals intelligence point of view, cryptography, IBM theory and operation, code compilation, and the preparation of cryptanalytic code sheets. There were more advanced courses that actually covered language instructions in Japanese, German, Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, along with the cryptanalysis. Those in the Navy, after completing boot camp, were actually sent to study cryptology for several months in many different colleges, including Goucher, Smith, and Mount Holyoke. However, not everyone would come to work in cryptology needed the analytic training. So, thousands of women also worked in other signal security areas that required different sets of skills. The women in the Army's 2nd Signal Service Battalion worked on high speed radio operations, teletype operators, switchboard operators, cryptographic code clerks, cryptanalysts, and route clerks. They put their skills to work monitoring enemy communications. And the training emphasized that if they didn't understand or hear a portion of the code, they were not to guess. It was better to have a blank than to have an incorrect letter, a wrong guess, or something that would affect the cryptanalyst's ability to break that message. At Two Rocks Ranch in California, the WACs copied the Japanese katakana Morse code. WACs at Van Til Farms in Virginia provided similar information from the Axis powers, but they also monitored U.S. communications looking for weaknesses. Wax and the Signal Corps also traveled around the world working in England, Italy, Algeria, and other countries. And these female Signal Corps personnel in Europe reached over 1,700. This accounted for nearly one quarter of the wax station in the theater, though not all of them were involved in this type of work. Considerably fewer women actually specialized in communications that were sent to the Pacific Theater. The Signal Intelligence Service assigned WACs in New Guinea, Australia, and the Philippines, amongst other locations, as America gained control of the South Pacific. One report described 120 WACs with the SIS in the South Pacific area as highly skilled and that their work needed to be of a highly secret nature. Life was not always easy for them. Shift work duties interrupted regular sleeping and eating habits, which led to health related problems. By midsummer 1944, women in the theater began to suffer from fatigue and depression, and their sick rate was twice as high as other WACs and morale was quite low. The chief signal officer of the theater blamed the working hours and the stress of the job. However, officers in the medical corps actually thought it was coming from a lack of leaves or furloughs, and the rotating shifts never allowed them to adjust to a new sleep pattern. And after the long hours off duty training, in addition to their regular work. So the wax station on the South Pacific suffered the most. Supplies of lightweight uniforms were nearly unavailable, and the women were actually forced to wear heavy winter clothes in the hot, humid climate. This included wearing long pants to protect against malaria carrying mosquitoes, resulting in perspiration and damp clothing and higher rate of skin disease from that. Rather than wear protective clothing and suffer, some women chose to take their chances with the mosquitoes and as a result, contracted malaria more often than their male counterparts who were issued the long but lightweight uniforms. Despite this, living in these types of conditions, the women perform their duties admirably, intercepting enemy radio communications or sending U.S. coded messages back to Arlington Hall. But living conditions aside, there was work to be done in Arlington Hall, home of the Army Security Agency, which is now the new name for the Army's Cryptologic Service. And they received information from both the European and the Pacific Theater. It was logged, analyzed, translated, duplicated, and distributed. They were also responsible for developing the codes and the machines that would actually protect the US communications. And by the end of the war, Arlington Hall has 5,700 civilians, of which it is estimated 70% of them were women, 630 officers, 1,000 WACs, and 600 enlisted men, all working around the clock. But there's little information about African American women in cryptology during World War II. They were involved towards the end of the war in 1944, however, and the African Americans may have been recruited because of Eleanor Roosevelt. It was said that the Army needed to have approximately 15% of personnel be blacks, and they should be working in meaningful positions. William Coffey, the gentleman standing in the back of this photo, a college educated man working at AHS as a messenger, was tapped to recruit the people who would be giving this meaningful work. He hired many women, presumably school teachers, as they had become the first all Black office at Arlington Hall. They worked in commercial traffic sections of the cryptanalytic branch and studied non governmental commercial code messages from all over the world, including our allies. Okay. Just to kind of give you a bit of a little bit more background. These communications were using both private codes and codes available on the open market, and they were found to have been written in an unknown commercial code or in an enciphered commercial code. Okay. I.e., individual letters of the code phrase were substituted or transposed. They were then analyzed to identify the underlying code book and ultimately recover that plain text. And then that would be routed. The first women assigned to Arlington Hall found their barracks less than luxurious, but better than tents, and they were installed in newly constructed temporary buildings. These long rooms provided no privacy for the women and were heated actually in the winter by potbelly stoves. But they did have other amenities. There was a bank, a store, a soda counter, a cafeteria, in addition to the mess hall. And look, the mess hall even has a potbelly stove too. Recreational activities included softball, bowling, glee club, and more. Like the WACs in the 2nd Signal Service Battalion, many of the waves performed similar communication activities at the naval stations in the United States, such as Bainbridge Island in Washington or Imperial Beach. California was where most of this occurred. Waves were not permitted to be stationed overseas until the late 1944. So some of these women were intercept operators collecting Japanese telegraphic code and Japanese naval messages. Other waves were sent the messages by landline using a teletype machine. The waves had to type on punched paper up to 100 words per minute to keep up with the machine so the tape never broke. The living conditions were not as harsh as those faced by the WACs in the South Pacific by any means. Imperial Beach had a movie theater, recreation hall, ship store, and post office. There was even some married housing, but it also had their drawbacks. Like every station, they worked 3 8-hour shifts, 24 a day, with 2 days off between switching to the next shift. To go on Liberty, they had to hike to the main road and wait for a Navy bus to hitch a ride. Unthinkable today, but at the time, the women didn't have any problems with this. On Bainbridge Island, the women's barracks were located down a hill from the main buildings, requiring them to climb 129 steps to get to work. And on Liberty, they had to catch a ferry to get off the island to Seattle or Bremerton. So staying on the island had limited options, but included Russ's Tavern or the Bloody Bucket. Intercepted messages from the West Coast stations went to the Naval Communications Annex in Washington, D.C., where there were other waves provided analysis, decryption, translation, and distribution. Hundreds of other waves, some of whom volunteered to go west, found that they had been stationed in Dayton, Ohio. In May of 1942, the U.S. Navy established a contract with the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio, for some naval work. 600 waves would arrive to work in the Building 26. They were taught the basics of electronics and spent their duty hours soldering wires. They were given menus to follow, but for the secretary's sake, the menus were color coded and the waves soldered one side while a different wave soldered the other. They didn't know at the time, but they helped construct the machines that found the settings for the German Enigma messages. And just so you understand, they only did their portion of the machine. They did not know what everybody else was doing. So it was just their little section, and then it would make this giant machine. So speaking of this giant machine, the waves worked in rotating shifts 24/7, constructing the U.S. Navy bombs. Beginning in the fall of 1943, the bombs were shipped to the Naval Communications Annex on Nebraska Avenue in D.C. Some of the Dayton waves transferred with them. Thousands of others arrived in Washington to operate the 2-ton machines. And our museum hosts the last of the 121 that were built. Here, too, they work in 3 shifts. This is down in DC now, 24 hours a day, and they operated these bombs under hot and noisy working conditions. But the work was vital. By finding the settings of the German enigmas encrypted messages, the Allies learned of the tactical plans and movements of the Germans. And again, the need for secrecy was impressed upon these women. And in fact, women were not told what it was that they worked on, only how to operate the machines. And on one occasion, a correct solution was accidentally thrown away, causing a delay and requiring the specific menu to be run a second time. The bomb deck supervisor was given permission to shut down the machines. He called the waves around him as he climbed on a chair in the middle of the deck, and he spent 10 minutes telling them how crucial their work was to the men fighting overseas and the attention needed to detail. But he never mentioned specifically what they worked on, only that it was important. And although the bomb decks were hot, particularly on humid summer days in Washington, it wasn't until much later that the bomb decks actually got air conditioning, and that AC was actually meant to keep the machines cool, not the women. Um, they didn't have it much better in their own quarters either. The original wave quarters across from the annex building housed more than 4,000 women on 2 floors. 84 women shared one large room. They slept on bunks and their personal belongings in a steel locker. The women that worked the midnight to 8 a.m. shift had difficulty sleeping during the day, not only to the light, but the noise that was coming by the others going about their daily routines. And again, reports concluded that it was difficult sleeping conditions and the lack of privacy that caused waves to become ill rather than the actual work itself. This was supported by the fact that civilian women, often doing the same or similar work to their military coworkers, were not as sick. The difference being is that they ate and slept regularly, took routine vacations, and lived in private housing. As Quarter D expanded, the newer buildings utilized cubicles to house 4 women and provide some of that privacy. Like Arlington Hall, these waves had other amenities, including a post office, beauty salon, mess hall, and a soda counter. And they also have recreational activities like tennis, basketball, theater, and dance. So they could ride up to Fort Meade and dance with the soldiers. At the end of the war, most of the women went home. Although some swore they would never come back to do cryptologic work, mostly because of the shift work, about 10% did return as civilians. Despite some of the challenges, it was with pride that they recalled their secret war work. Told never to discuss what they did, many never did. What they remembered and discussed were the friendships they made, some of them lifelong, and the sights they saw in a new and exciting city or country. For these women, their time in the service was an opportunity to experience new people, places, and sometimes cultures. For the civilian women, life in cryptology continued after the war. Many had been involved before World War II began and saw no reason why that should end. Some women even recalled that they stayed with Codebreaking because nobody ever specifically told them to go. Further, the Army seems to have found jobs for the most of its extra employees. The military cryptologic branch of the Army Security Agency ended up with a surplus of 79 people, men and women, in November 1945. Jobs for them were found in the training school. And when the Army no longer had any positions, they helped them find them at other federal agencies. Many of the women who stayed on or returned to the cryptologic field went on to make major contributions after the war. Marie Meyer joined the Army's cryptologic organization in 1943, probably as a German linguist. She had a master's degree in Latin and spoke French, German, Sanskrit, and Greek. After the war, she was the second linguist assigned to the Venona program, examining Soviet KGB messages. Apparently, she'd taken a Russian correspondence course in the summer of 1946, and she is credited, along with Alice Joyce, as making the first code group recoveries to the Soviet system. Velva Classy joined the World War II effort in 1944 and remained in cryptanalysis after the war. Highly respected as a technical consultant, she went on to become one of the first women sent overseas for a leadership position. And in 1970, she became the first woman to hold a senior liaison office
Not
post
exactly exciting.
representing NSA in Ottawa, Canada. Dottie Bloom here earned a bachelor's degree and then joined the Army Security Agency in 1944. Staying in cryptology after the war, she pioneered the use of computers and their applications to cryptology. And in 1972, she became the chief of the Computer Operations Organization, the only woman in that management chain. She progressed on to become the chief of their Plans and Projects Development Office of Computers, a position that she held until her death in 1980. Juanita Moody left college in North Carolina in early 1943 when she realized how many young men were dropping out to serve their country. She didn't feel right enjoying college while others were fighting. So she joined the hundreds of other women at Arlington Hall and began sorting messages and punching cards. She soon demonstrated a talent for cryptanalysis and was given more challenging assignments. When the war ended, her supervisor asked her to stay. NSA had a group for the Soviets, B group for China, and G group for everyone else. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, it fell to G group first. And Miss Moody was its chief. And she was responsible for giving the president up to the minute reports through that crisis. Ann Kara Christie graduated from college in 1942 and a week later came to the Army Security Agency. She initially sorted raw traffic for her team, working on Japanese Army enciphered messages, but quickly advanced to cryptanalysis and then supervising other cryptanalysts. After the war, she returned to the fledgling agency. She established a new laboratory to study new communication phenomena and organized a program infrastructure for training new employees. Over the decades, her responsibilities grew and she finished her career as the deputy director of the National Security Agency, which is the highest position a civilian can hold. Thousands of women have helped to win the World War II through their cryptologic efforts. Their dedication and abilities provided to more than one doubting male commander that women could do more than adequately do this exacting, detailed, and important work. And they left behind a strong legacy, allowing for thousands of women to continue in their footsteps. So this is actually the end of my presentation of sharing the burden, but I did want to point out a couple of things, and then I will take a few questions pertaining to what we talked about today. If at any point in time you would like to email us for more information or research something, you can find us at that crypto_museum at nsa.gov or give us a call. We have tons of publications as well, including this one, which you can find at the NSA Historical Publications if you just Google it. And if you are ever in the area, in the Maryland area, and you want to come visit us, we are open Monday through Saturday, 10 to 4, completely free. Bring the kids, bring the grandkids, have a wonderful time with us.
Thank you so much, Jen.